And there was so much outcry about her nomination. People were writing in letters, people were all over social media on it, contacting senators and whatnot. That one Democrat, actually, John Ossoff from Georgia, broke ranks with his party to side with Republicans and reject moving the nomination forward. The final vote was 11-10, so Ossoff had a decisive role here. It was actually the first time that this panel blocked one of Biden's nominees. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our weekly news roundup. We are here today with me, Ariane, Joss, and Sylvia, and we are all volunteers for LGB Alliance USA. So as our overview of what news we're going to discuss, we are going to start with an update about a gender-critical teacher who was fired in Massachusetts. We are going to talk about the Tremaine Carroll hearing in California about men and women's prisons. We're going to talk about a House vote on Title IX, a really obnoxious social media outburst from the National Organization for Women. We're going to talk about Matthew Shepard, the old famous story of Matthew Shepard, and some updates about that case. And we're also going to talk about Judge Sarah Netburn, appointment of which was blocked recently. So I'll begin by talking about the story of a Massachusetts teacher who was fired for uploading gender-critical TikTok content. On July 3rd, she lost her First Amendment case in front of the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, as some background on this case, this teacher, who's named Carrie McRae, she was campaigning for the Bourne School Committee when she uploaded videos that were critical of critical race theory and gender ideology. Now, the Hanover School District hired McRae as a teacher, not knowing about her TikTok content. And when they found out about her content, they fired her. And she sued about this and lost her case in a district court. And now, more recently, on July 3rd, she lost her case in front of an appeals court. The judges ruled that her speech could be disruptive and students would not feel safe studying with her. The judges also faulted her because she did not take her termination on the chin. And McRae's lawyer, Michael Bekesha from Judicial Watch, says they plan to appeal this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is an important case. This is a disappointing outcome because it has some very worrying implications for free speech and for people who really want to speak out against gender ideology. How are we supposed to do that now on social media when we have this terrifying fear that we could be fired for that because our speech is too controversial, it's too disruptive? So here's to hoping that this makes its way to the Supreme Court and we get a more favorable First Amendment ruling. Now moving on to a story in California. The preliminary hearings for the Tremaine Carroll trial were held on July 8th. Carroll is a trans-identifying male inmate who had been convicted of kidnapping and placed in a women's prison, thanks to California Bill SB 132. He now faces 2 counts of rape and witness intimidation, which he allegedly committed while in the women's prison. Now, the radical feminist group WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front, has been highlighting this case and organized a protest in front of the Superior Court of the County of Madera, where the trial hearings are taking place. So kudos to WOLF for drawing attention to this issue. Hopefully, this case will serve as a wake-up call for the problems with SB 132, which was the California bill that made it easier to transfer trans-identifying male inmates to women's prisons. And with that, Joss, it's now your turn.
Thanks, Ariane. So I'm going to start with the House vote to save Title IX. The U.S. House voted along party lines and passed a measure, HJ Resolution 165, to reverse the Education Department's rule change, which conflates gender with sex in Title IX. As we are aware from previous weekly news roundups, 26 states with Republican attorneys general have sued to block the rule changes in the courts, and 14 states have temporary blocks in place starting August 1st. These states are Alaska, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Ohio, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. This resolution was introduced by Representative Mary Miller in early June, and the Republican-controlled House Committee on Education and the Workforce approved it a week later. The resolution seeks to reverse the Biden Title IX changes through the Congressional Review Act, which is a procedural tool Congress can use to overturn certain actions from federal agencies. The Senate version has been introduced by Republican Cindy Hyde-Smith and has 30 Republican co-sponsors. Despite overwhelming support from Republicans in the House and Senate, Biden's ability to veto will almost certainly prevent the resolutions from being adopted. Unsurprisingly, HRC used this wording in their press release about the vote, which strongly mirrored the opinions expressed by many House Democrats. MAGA House Republicans pass resolution to undo Title IX rule protecting LGBTQ plus students, pregnant and parenting students, and survivors of sexual assault and harassment. The Democrats and all legacy LGBTQ advocacy groups use rhetoric that invokes sexual assault survivors, pregnant women, and LGBTQ plus students in their opposition. What I personally find challenging about using those particular categories is that it feels really exploitative, especially when the rule changes, as we've discussed at length since they were first announced, actually undermine and disadvantage women, girls, and same-sex oriented people in a variety of ways. Now to the National Organization of Women, which misses the mark yet again. The National Organization for Women has displayed yet another tragic misstep in judgment by platforming Non-Binary Awareness Week with this quote: "You're not against pronouns. You're against anyone whose gender doesn't align with your perception being treated with basic respect. Everyone has pronouns. You just don't want people who feel the need to articulate theirs to participate in public life because you're a bigot." Further, they invoked the hashtags abortion rights, pro-choice, reproductive rights, racial justice, racism, Black Lives Matter, queer, DEI, and pride in this post on Instagram. One might wonder, as I have, what do pronouns have to do with any of those hashtags? Possibly most importantly, why is there a non-binary awareness week at all? The quote itself makes plain that everyone already knows people identify as non-binary and opt to use specialized pronouns. It isn't as if we aren't aware. Personally, I find a group like Now sharing hot takes like this to be as obnoxious as dedicating an entire week to coddling an already overly entitled segment of our population by dedicating an entire week to non-binary awareness. And now I will hand it over to Sylvia.
Standing ovation for that analysis about the already coddled, already entitled group. So I came across a story this week, which technically came out last week, and that's about something that actually happened over almost 10 years ago, but it was news to me, so it's making our weekly news segment. As many of our listeners probably know, Matthew Shepard was a gay man that lived in Laramie, Wyoming, and he was murdered in 1998. And it was considered by some as the gay version of the Emmett Till story, which in my opinion is a extremely offensive comparison once you find out what actually happened. It was reported that Matthew Shepard was murdered because he tried to pick up a man at a bar, and the man got upset because Matthew was gay and beat him to death and tied him to a pole, leaving him to die. From that event, there was a play written and then a film. LGBT charity groups were born out of that, and that whole story is taught in schools, and the town of Laramie in Wyoming is now synonymous with the place where gay hate crime happens. However, Ben Kowaller, who works for the Free Press, went back to Laramie to investigate what really happened, because in 2004, there was a 2020 segment that was co-produced by the journalist Stephen Jimenez that posited that the attack on Shepard was, quote, motivated not by hatred of homosexuals, but by drugs and money. And that argument was fleshed out in Jimenez's 2013 book, The Book of Matt, the real story of the murder of Matthew Shepard, which I believe is possibly on our reading list for our book club. So that will be an exciting read. As it turns out, this was actually a story not of a gay hate crime, but of two drug addicts that had a disagreement over money, and one was beaten to death, which is still tragic and is a newsworthy story. However, the narrative surrounding Laramie, Wyoming, and the subsequent creation of charities and movies and films is incorrect, possibly. And what I found interesting about this Free Press article and video, because there's a video that goes along with this article, is that Ben, the writer of the article, is interviewing people at Laramie Pride. And there was a wide range of opinions about whether or not this murder of Matthew Shepard was a hate crime or a drug deal gone wrong. And one quote in particular struck me. A woman said, quote, "To me, it didn't matter whether or not drugs were involved because the excuse the defense tried to use in court to get a lighter sentence was that it was, quote, gay-induced panic." However, she then later goes on to confirm that the defense didn't work. But purely because the defense was, oh, gay panic, she feels that it doesn't matter if it was really about drugs or not, because it might as well have been a hate crime and be talked about as if it were a hate crime, even though that's not entirely true. And this story just really, really stuck out to me because I grew up knowing this story, learning about this story, and thinking it was a hate crime. And like the writer of the article, Ben, made me feel a type of way about small towns and feel like maybe as a homosexual woman, I shouldn't go to places like that. When in fact, Laramie is actually a very accepting and neutral place. And it should be considered good news that it's not a hate crime, that Matthew Shepard was not killed due to a hate crime. It should be considered good news that it was a drug deal money problem. But instead, this narrative has been chosen to shape the story of Matthew Shepard and essentially rewrite the history of something that happened. And it's a really fascinating article. So even though it is technically last week, I highly encourage people to go to the Free Press, read the article, or at least watch the video that Ben put out of him interviewing the people at Laramie Pride. That's what I have.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was just an amazing overview. I too remember that whole. I remember when the Matthew Shepard murder happened when I was a little kid, and I always remembered it as a hate crime. And it's so strange to see how much more complexity that is their narrative. So, thank you for that. I'm going to just add one more story to our news roundup. The Senate Judiciary Committee blocked the nomination of Judge Sarah Netburn. And we have reported on Netburn before. She was a controversial choice due to her decision to recommend that a trans-identifying male sex offender, William McLean, be transferred to a federal women's prison. And there was so much outcry about her nomination. People were writing in letters, people were all over social media on it, contacting senators and whatnot, that one Democrat, actually, John Ossoff from Georgia, broke ranks with his party to side with Republicans and reject moving the nomination forward. The final vote was 11-10, so Ossoff had a decisive role here. It was actually the first time that this panel blocked one of Biden's nominees. So kudos to people like Amy Ichikawa for warning people about this nomination and the hazards it would pose to vulnerable women. And kudos for everyone who did, in fact, speak out, who wrote letters. I think this is a very inspiring example of how actually we can make a difference in some cases. And hopefully this is a crack right now, one Democrat from a swing state breaking ranks with his party is a crack in the right direction, right? So I'm feeling a little bit optimistic about that, and we'll see how that goes. And I also want to emphasize too, there are a lot of people, a lot of our supporters out there who are like, they really are upset with the Democrats on this issue. But they are lifelong Democrats. They don't feel comfortable voting for Republicans either for other reasons. There are other outlets here where you can have your voice be heard, and part of that could be things like writing letters. So, good story.
Yeah, as a lifelong Democrat, I am heartened to see that John Ossoff made that break in the rank, and that the people's voices have been heard. The people are speaking out. It is important to stay in the party, even if the party really frustrates us, and to push our party in a way that makes sense for those of us who are Democrats. Of course, LGBT Alliance USA is a nonpartisan organization, and we have volunteers of all different political affiliations. But for me personally, as a very liberal woman, lesbian, and Democrat, I am really heartened to see this happen, and am hopeful that this is the trajectory that we're continuing to take.
I would add, for me, it feels really nice to see a politician of any party vote with what they feel is the right choice, regardless of what the pressure from their party tells them, regardless of what donors say, even if it means voting against what the majority of your party, quote unquote, your party is voting for, to remain true to your values, that I find the most honorable thing. And I will happily vote for any person that is consistently true to their values and isn't wishy-washy. I would much rather vote for a genuine person than anyone who can be bought.
Yeah, and I'm curious too. I mean, this is going into sort of political gossiping, but Biden's in a very vulnerable position right now. He had that very bad debate performance. There's been some pressure on him to drop out, and I'm wondering if maybe there's now some pressure on Democrats to sort of, maybe they're now seeing a sinking ship and seeing an opportunity maybe to be a little bit of a maverick. I don't know.
What I've heard from my friends about voting Democrat is that we're voting for the party, and we're voting for a leadership body. And so that makes it all the more important for us to stay in the party and to affect change from within. Because if Biden is a puppet and we're voting for this leadership body, the leadership body needs to listen to us. So hopefully the leadership body will take note of John Ossoff, and we'll see more and more of that happen. And gossip, political gossip or not, it really is relevant to where we are as a country. We're facing a really awful situation in November because we don't have good choices right now. So this is very heartening to me, facing an election cycle.
And I'm definitely, been in dialogue with a lot of people, women who are involved in this fight, and gays who are involved in this fight. And there are a lot of people are all over the place about, some people are going to vote for Trump, some people will vote for Biden, some people are not going to vote, some people are going to find a third party, some people are voting for Kennedy. So it's going to be interesting to see how ultimately all the cards fall into place with this. And with that, thank you everyone for tuning in to this week's news roundup, and we hope to see you again next week.